The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
Let me refer to this idea of reforms. You know, like if we had a little more regulation and scrutiny, we wouldn't have these kinds of economic crises. Well, this is Richard Wolff speaking. Reforms don't work or last in the way that people want them to, precisely because when we reform this economic system, we leave in place the institutions that will undo those reforms. What do I mean by that? There is no easy way to say this indirectly. I mean corporations. The people who run corporations, the handful of major shareholders, together with boards of directors, they're the ones who gather into their hands the profits of our society. They're the ones who have the decision-making power over the productive apparatus of our country. For them, every one of the reforms has been a burden and an obstacle. Their job is to make money for themselves through the mechanism of the corporations they own or direct. They're hired to do that. They're paid to do that. They're rewarded in this system for doing that. And so I think any notion about, cosmetic changes, let's talk about, capitalism is a corpse. It's a dead body, but you can make it look better. Okay, a little blusher here, a little lipstick here, a little eyeliner there, maybe dye your hair a little blue or pink or whatever. But essentially, you cannot revive this corpse. So I think it's urgent that we look at alternative ways of organizing the political economy.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Barsamian.
I see some members from the National Federation of Community Broadcasters who have come all the way from Houston. How fabulous. Norm Stockwell from WORT in Madison, a real comrade, and thank you. I thank KOOP for organizing this event and meeting my friend Jeff Zavala, who's done a lot for alternative radio, and Grace, and all of you here. Again, thanks so much for coming. We interrupt this program from Austin, Texas to bring you this breaking news story from TIBC, the Truth in Broadcasting Corporation, from our world corporate headquarters in a secure underground location in Area 51 in Nevada. I'm Dick Veneer, your glib and banal anchor of Facade News. Facade News, the 24/7 newscast that goes straight to the surface of a story and stays there. We're inspired by the highest ethics of journalism. We're not encumbered by facts or evidence. We deceive, you believe. Our credo's unfair and unbalanced, without fear or favor. That's us. Ladies and gentlemen, an amazing story coming across our news desk. An obscure radio station in Austin, Texas, KOOP, K-O-O-P, is reporting that Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Alan Greenspan, Tim Geithner, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, Lloyd Blankfein, and other government officials and bankers have been arrested for financial crimes against the people and crimes against the environment. They were found under the Congress Avenue Bridge with trillions of dollars in cash and a stash of World Wrestling Federation DVDs, a massive collection of Kenny G CDs, and scores of unopened Papa John's pizza boxes. They were taken into custody by a heretofore unknown group calling itself ULF, the Austin Liberation Front. Zavala, a so-called spokesperson for this so-called group, who would not give his last name, said, "This action is long overdue. We're dedicated to nonviolence and did not use force. But we had to act. We can no longer wait for Congress or the Obama Justice Department to enforce the law. They must face justice," he said, his voice rising in indignation. The prisoners, shackled in orange jumpsuits and with black cloaks over their head, were later reported to have said to their captors defiantly, "Do you know who we are? We are the masters of the universe. We are the smartest guys in the room. And then, inexplicably, they burst into tears. If convicted, they will do time at Guantanamo. You all remember the infamous U.S. prison that was returned to Cuban sovereignty in late 2012. It looks like curtains for the former masters of the universe. Their heads were bowed as they were led away by blue-helmeted peacekeepers of the ALF, the Austin Liberation Front, headed by Commander Allen, who would not give his last name. Stay tuned for TIBC for updates on this breaking news story. I'm Dick Veneer, still your glib and banal anchor. And remember, we deceive, you believe. You either watch our news or you will be watched. And now back to our regularly scheduled program in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
Well, good evening, Austin. How cool is it to be here? Well, actually, it's a little warm, but it's great to be back in Texas, and I promise no jokes about Texas. I know you probably just had it up to here with wisecracks, wise-ass New Yorkers who now live in Colorado making comments about, the great state of Texas. But, it's always a privilege to be in Peristan. Peri, incidentally, in Urdu and Farsi, two languages which I'm sure you're all very conversant with, means like an angel. So Peristan would be the land of the angels. I guess you must feel like that. You're living in Texas. Alternative radio started in Boulder. It's been doing all of these programs, for many years, including, I must say, Bob Jensen, who is in the audience this evening. And for example, just in the last couple of months, people like Noam Chomsky, which I've been associated with for many, many years, Unconventional Wisdom, Michael Parenti, Maud Barlow, Thomas Frank, Garal Perovitz, Michael Moore, Andrew Nikiforuk, not a household name in the United States, a top investigative journalist in Canada, in Alberta, who knows more about the tar sands and what's going on there than anybody else that I know of. And so I think that's a very important issue. It has a lot to do with the petro-industrial complex. He calls Texas, by the way, a petro-state. He also calls his home province of Alberta a petro-state as well. Coming up in the coming weeks on Alternative Radio, there'll be a program with David Cobb, Move to Amend to reverse the heinous Supreme Court decision of January 2010, Citizens United. Cornel West, many of you know, Occupy Democracy. A wonderful British scholar named Chris Williams did a program called Ecology and Socialism. And one of the fun things I get to do as a roving journalist, I'm not just someone who screeches at audiences and talks out of chronological order, but I also go around and record a lot of people. And I was in Eugene a couple of weeks ago, and I found this wonderful Haitian-American man, Max Rameau, who's done much to alert people about the housing crisis and all of the foreclosures, and has raised this whole issue of possibly, there are all these houses out here, out here, that are vacant. There are all these people over here sleeping under bridges. And, I see them even in Boulder, which is a pretty upscale town, right? They're coming out of the bushes in the morning, after having slept in the bushes and under the bridges. So you have all of those people all over the country who don't have housing, all of this empty housing. Why can't those people find shelter in all of those vacant houses? And Max Rameau is talking about that in a program called Gimme Shelter. And yes, I do use the Rolling Stones song as the outro theme. Well, AR is part of this community radio universe, and I do rail against the media with much justification, I would say, in the United States. But it's also important to point out that the U.S. has one of the most elaborate and I think best community radio networks, from Tampa, WMNF, to KBOO in Portland, to KJNU in Boulder, to WRT in Madison. It's very impressive, and I think it's something we can build on. So I don't know if you're all members of COOP, but you might think about volunteering there or doing whatever you can to support the station. It's certainly a tonic to KUT, cut or coot, I don't know how you pronounce it, that cuts out reality, cuts out information, and pretty much follows the party line that's coming out from Washington. And speaking of party lines, and again, since we're in Texas, I picked this up when I was on a tour, speaking tour in Oregon. Obviously, it's dated now. It's Ron Paul for president. His brochure, and for those of you in the cheap seats, you can't see it, so I'll hold this up also very close to the mic so radio listeners get a sense of what's here. It's a profile of Ron Paul, looking very determined and heroic. And underneath him are the founding fathers. Now, this is a trope that repeats itself in American politics, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. Somehow they have to connect to these founding fathers, or the founding finaglers, as Michael Parenti called them. I think it's, there's a lot of mythology. All states in their creations have founding myths. And there's a lot of mythologizing about the founding fathers and who they were. Well, let me just quote from a couple of them. You may not have heard of these quotes, but this is from a book I did with Noam Chomsky called How the World Works. Only someone like Chomsky could have a title like that, How the World Works. But he quotes James Madison, who is probably the main writer of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, along with Alexander Hamilton. And James Madison said, "The aim of government," I'm quoting here, "is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority." What? To protect the minority of the opulent? Is that the 1% against the majority, the 99%? There it is. I mean, right at the get-go, they're laying it out for you. We rule. This is our country. We will control things. John Jay, again, no radical leftist he, also a first Supreme Court justice. He was the first president of the Constitutional Convention. He said it straight out, in the language that Al Capone would understand. Those that own the country ought to govern it. There it is, and that's how it's been for well nigh these 200 plus years. I did land at the probably the only airport in the United States named for an absolute, war criminal. That is George H.W. Bush International in Houston. It was very interesting to see, the statue. Usually they wait for these people to die before they honor. Maybe Bush died and then, came back, or he's already dead and he's entombed somewhere, or he's like frozen like Ted Williams in some ice box somewhere. But anyway, why Bush? I mean, it struck me, do we live in the USA, as Gore Vidal reminds us, the United States of amnesia. And, we don't have a media that informs, that enlightens, of course, except for KOOP, alternative radio, and a few other outlets. But, basically, the media play the spectrum very, very tightly. You get a range of opinion from about A to B on a good day. Sometimes it's A to A square, between, when should we attack Iran? Will as the great Anderson Cooper says on CNN, asking a really tough question of, they have this debate, one retired major general and the other a four-star general, who are now on, we later learn, are probably on Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin payrolls. And the question is, how effective will an attack on Iran be? Can they do the jobs? Do we have the firepower to, clean out all of the nests of Iranians, buried deep under caves under the Congress Avenue Bridge and elsewhere? And that's the nature of political discourse. No one talks about international law, evidence, Geneva Conventions, the UN Charter. I mean, this doesn't even occur to them, or someone like, Anderson Cooper or Leslie Stahl or Christiane Amanpour. Just go down the list of these millionaire infotainers. You can't even call them journalism. They're not doing journalism. They're doing stenography. They'll go after Madonna, and be very heroic. Wow. How is it, adopting children in Rwanda? Do you feel that's like morally justifiable? Aren't you taking them out of their cultural, matrix and then putting them in New York or Hollywood or someplace like that? So they'll go after Madonna or Angelina Jolie. Are you going to stay married to Brad? I mean, are you having an affair on the side? Really vigorous and, investigative journalism. But when it comes to issues of life and death, of war and peace, of whether people have health care in this country, whether we have a clean environment and clean water and clean air, and whether we have an educational system that is affordable and housing that is affordable. Those things are not really, don't come under that kind of scrutiny, except within that very narrow band. So George H.W. Bush, he certainly deserves, I think, a few words, maybe a bit of a reminder to some of you here in this audience, a former CIA director, a former ambassador to China. But, here is the man who a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, does anyone remember that? This is a very young crowd. Anyway, it happened in 1989. A few weeks after that, what does he do? It was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were cascaded to this, endless slogans about, there's going to be a new world order, there's going to be a peace dividend, we're going to get, free health care, there'll be universal health care, there'll be free education, affordable housing, all of these things. Somehow, that quite didn't work out the way they had promised at the time. And then Bush, in December of 1989, invades Panama, during the course of which 3,000 Panamanians were killed. And people simply have forgotten that. That is a major war crime by any international standard. It is no different from the German army invading Norway in 1940. There's absolutely no difference at all. It was an act of aggression resulting in the deaths of thousands of Panamanians, whose names we don't know, because in the third world, the people of color, they are considered disposable by the master in Washington, who's usually a white man, not always. Sometimes they're white women that are mastering now with Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright, but it's usually white men that are making those kinds of decisions, resulting in the deaths of Iraqis, Pakistanis, Yemenis. I mean, a day doesn't go by in page 16 of the New York Times, which is arguably, I think, our best newspaper in terms of information. You don't see some report, 16 suspected terrorists killed in Yemen, 12 suspected terrorists killed in Pakistan. And you'll notice whenever they have these kinds of reports, they're always senior commanders, they're architects of great crimes, they're masterminds of 9/11, and that kind of language, that number 2 in Al-Qaeda has been killed and number 3. I guess they never killed janitors or telephone operators or, people that clean the streets and ordinary people. It's always like these, elite Al-Qaeda, operatives that they kill. Along the way, yes, there was collateral damage. Sorry about that. It was unintentional. What were those people doing there? What are the Afghans doing in Afghanistan? We would not have a problem with drone attacks and bombings if all the Afghan people would simply leave their country. I mean, doesn't that seem like a logical conclusion? If they weren't there, they wouldn't be getting hurt. They are putting themselves in harm's way. We, as peacekeepers of the world, the rulers of the universe, we seek to bring peace and democracy, and don't forget, liberation to the women of Afghanistan, because in case you haven't noticed, as Arundhati Roy of India has pointed out, the U.S. Marine Corps is actually a feminist organization dedicated to women's rights and the liberation of women. Well, the United States has been in Afghanistan now for 10 years. I've been to Afghanistan. I haven't been to Afghanistan in 10 years, but I have been to the country. And according to Malalai Joya, a remarkable Afghan woman who was elected to the Afghan parliament after the U.S. Invasion, and then had the courage to stand up in parliament and point fingers at all the warlords and drug traffickers and homicidal maniacs and misogynists that were now in the Afghan parliament, the allies of the United States, the cronies of Hamid Karzai, and to call them out on their drug trafficking and, molesting of young boys and the like. And she had to, she was forced out of parliament. She had to go underground. She was threatened with death. She still has to be basically undercover in her own country. Well, she told me that conditions actually for women in Afghanistan today are worse than they were under the Taliban. Under the Taliban, there were known parameters. You know, if you did this, this would happen. Okay. But in this current situation, which is so volatile, women don't know what they can do. They don't know if they can go to the market, if they can get married, if they can get engaged, if they can have a girlfriend come over, if they can have a cookout or a play date or anything like that. And so she says that things are actually much, much worse in Afghanistan. So, to get back to George H.W. Bush, who also justified the killing of 3,000 Panamanians and the invasion of Panama in order to apprehend a former employee of the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency, Manuel Noriega. Again, it's a very young crowd, so no one remembers the time, but I do very well. 1989, in Boulder, Panamanian jets were, flying over the city in broad daylight. I mean, the brazenness of this was really incredible. As they say in Sanskrit, I mean, the chutzpah was really impressive. Are there any Sanskrit speakers here? A couple, okay. I like to show off that, I studied this language in India when I was there. And, helicopter gunships, like literally right over our rooftops. So, I mean, I was like in great fear and apprehension of, Panama might take over the United States with their Navy and aircraft carrier battle groups and submarine fleets. And so you can imagine, I and other people in Boulder, we breathed a sigh of relief in 1989 when HW, invaded Panama and liberated that country. Well, that's, one part of his record. Another part, which is probably not very well known, is Iran Air 655. This was an Iranian jet that was shot out of the sky by a U.S. naval destroyer, the USS Vincennes. You may have, and the plane was in international airspace. It was a civilian plane. It was actually on an upward trajectory. The captain later reported that the plane had its nose pointing at the ship. This was completely debunked and refuted. In fact, the captain of a neighboring destroyer noticed they communicate, of course, and they're locked in electronically, that the Vincennes Aegis missile system was locked in on those aircrafts. So on the aircraft, the Iranian plane, the civilian jet. And so he's trying to call up the other captain and say, that's a civilian jet in international airspace, and it was too late. The missiles had launched, the plane was shot out of the sky, 290 people were killed. To this date, no apology has been offered, compensation has not been offered. But, Iranians remember things like this. They remember the arrogance of empire and the imperial attitudes that arrogance embodies. And when Bush was president, he was presented with irrefutable proof that this aircraft, the Iran Air, it was a Boeing jet, by the way, was in international airspace. And his comment at the time, for which I think he should be remembered for all time, I don't care what the facts are, I will never apologize for the United States of America. Now, when I was in Iran a couple of years ago, people mentioned this to me. In addition to mentioning the destruction of Iranian democracy in 1953 in the CIA coup, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a very popular, you would call him kind of a New Deal Democrat. I mean, he was no Marxist-Leninist. He was a pretty mainstream guy. But he did have serious flaws. I mean, we have to be honest as journalists. First and foremost, he was educated at the Sorbonne and spoke French. I shouldn't have to say anything more, café au lait, croissant, la vie en rose, Edith Piaf. And so he had funny ideas, very funny ideas. He believed that the resources in Iran should benefit the Iranian people. I mean, how silly can you be, right? I mean, it's totally lunatic. Because at the time, there was a certain oil company. There is oil in the Middle East, in case you were uncertain about that. It's not about cauliflower or broccoli or dates or figs or mangoes. It's about oil. And a certain company called the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company was keeping 100% of all the profits. They were going into London and New York banks. Nothing remained in Iran. So Mossadegh thought, well, this is weird. We're in Austin, keep it weird. And so he nationalized the oil. I mean, clearly an act of, disobedience that cannot be tolerated because of the threat of a good example. This is a theme that runs through U.S. foreign policy. If anybody gets away with anything, other people, vis-a-vis Washington, then other people might get the idea. That's why the Sandinista revolution has to be destroyed. That's why the FMLN in El Salvador has to be co-opted and destroyed. You cannot have a good example to emulate, for others to emulate. And so in 1953, the CIA organizes a coup. It's led by Kermit Roosevelt. It's called Operation Ajax. Quickly, the Iranians are saturated with a propaganda campaign that they'll all have to learn Russian, that Mossadegh is a communist. This was absolutely repeated, almost verbatim, the next year in Guatemala with Jacobo Arbenz, who was also kind of like a New Deal Roosevelt Democrat. In fact, he modeled his political platform on many aspects of the New Deal. And so Iranians were told, they'd have to learn Russian, the mosque would be closed, Islam, there would be no public display or praying of Islam and this kind of thing. And it had an effect. The coup happens, Mossadegh is arrested, put under house arrest, and the Shah of Iran, who had fled the country, is flown back on a CIA jet and ensconced on the peacock throne, from whence he ruled for the next 26 years, which directly leads to the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, the overthrow of the Shah, and the beginning of this war with Iran, which basically has not ended since 1979. The U.S. has really never accepted the Islamic Revolution and its triumph. Again, like The Godfather, the U.S. remembers anyone who crosses them and will keep punishing them until they say uncle or surrender. And so it was also at that time in the early 90s when H.W. was president, when the war on Iraq was launched and the imposition of the most draconian sanctions in the history of the world, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Bush said, what we say goes. I think that's pretty clear, when you articulate that kind of doctrine. But, this is very much a bipartisan affair. I mean, Bush is an easy target. Look at Madeleine Albright just 3 years later as Secretary of State, right? Liberal Madeleine Albright, daughter of Joseph Corbell, trained at the University of Denver. She said when asked about the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children that have died because of the sanctions in Iraq, she said it's kind of unfortunate, but that's the price that has to be paid by them, Notice we never pay the price. Well, we do in a moral sense, but in terms of our lives, it's they that have to pay the price. And for those of you who have HBO, this is from, again, the Times on Thursday, a full-page ad with the great H.W. himself. There's a new documentary out called 41, His Family, His Triumphs, His Legacies, inside the life of George H.W. Bush, an American leader. Now, I haven't seen it, but I kind of suspect that some of the things that I just mentioned might not be commented upon during the course of the documentary. Interestingly, too, was the New York Times review of this documentary on HBO. Listen to what they write. This is on the same day, on Thursday, June 14th, Che Guevara's birthday, and my birthday as well. Yeah. So, thank you. This documentary is an homage to a good man who served his country well in war and peace. Now, this is supposed to be a review of the film, but you have to wonder about Alessandra Stanley, writing in the arts section of the New York Times to make that kind of political judgment against, about someone who is, I think, as I said, a war criminal. All right, enough about Bush. We've got even bigger fry to fish. Let's talk about capitalism and imperialism. These are like the kind of strays that are out there and are fairly easy to pick off. It's much harder to talk about the forest in which these trees grow and thrive, and in fact are well rewarded. People like Rumsfeld and W. and Cheney, write their memoirs. They get millions of dollars in speaker fees, and New York book publishers, sign them up. And they're, and they go on Nightline, they're on CBS Reports, they're on Charlie Rose Hour, the News Hour, Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and treated with dignity. I mean, I don't know about you, but I find this absolutely outrageous. These guys should be wearing striped pajamas. They should have been, immediately apprehended by the UN or some kind of international agency, maybe at The Hague, and charged with war crimes, unambiguous war crimes. The same crimes that German generals and high administration officials of the Nazi regime at Nuremberg were accused of. The planning and waging of aggressive war. That is called, I'm quoting now from Nuremberg, as well as the UN Charter, the supreme international war crime. This is it. This is the top thing. Everything else, as the Charter says, is included within that particular charge. So the attack and war on Afghanistan, which continues, and on Iraq, the bombings of Yemen, Pakistan, invasions by U.S. troops of Pakistan, bombings in Somalia, these are all acts of aggression. But you notice in the propaganda system that we live under, acts of aggression are only attributed to designated enemies. So when a designated enemy attacks another country, then we hear about international law, morality, Geneva Conventions, the rights, human rights, etc., the responsibility to protect. But when the master acts, there's total silence. Because the master and his allies, be it the British or the Israelis or the French or whoever it might be, they get a permanent get-out-of-jail pass. They get a permanent, they're off scot-free. They all, you see, that's one of the benefits of being part of this, New World Order that Bush talked about, that both you, that is Washington, and its allies are not subject to any kind of criminal prosecution. So I think, when we talk about imperialism, which is basically U.S. foreign policy, I hope no one believes this stuff about democracy and freedom. I mean, that's really the kind of saccharine, it's the opiate that people are being fed here. in order to justify ongoing aggression, occupation, and guess what? Extraction of resources in many instances. On the economic side, you know, when we talk about the economic system, capitalism, again, it's the same thing goes on. It's all about a few rotten trees. It's never about the forest. You know, it's all about Bernie Madoff. It's all about, you know, who cheated, you know, grandmothers out of their last, you know, pennies. It's about Raj Rajaratnam, who was running a New York hedge fund called Galleon Funds, who you know, benefited from insider trading and made huge amounts of money. His cohort was just convicted on Friday, Rajat Gupta. It's about Sanford. It's about, you know, individuals that exploit, and they're called actually in the NewsHour these reckless guys, you know, that are out of control, that seem to have no morality. Well, and everyone can feel really righteous and virtuous about denouncing them. How terrible it is, and it is terrible. You know, he looted. Let's take, you know, Madoff. You know, he looted the, you know, bank accounts and savings of you know, not wealthy people in many instances. But the overall picture is occluded. It becomes obfuscated. It becomes masked over. And so it's just about these rotten trees. If any of you are gardeners here, let me use that example, right? Because I think, let's say you have a garden and weeds keep coming up, right? And you keep weeding the weeds, and they're back, and they're back again. You know, you even put some Roundup Ready from Monsanto, you know, this deadly pesticide with which Indian farmers are committing suicide with by ingesting once they go into debt. You know, that's not working either, because after a while, the weeds are able to immunize themselves to the pesticide. So might you think, as a gardener, that you would look at the soil in which those weeds keep sprouting up? Might there be something in the soil that is causing that? And I think the answer is transparent. Of course there is. And until and unless we look at the soil, we're going to be dealing with the weeds. You know, until and unless we look at our own, you know, physical being and just focus on zits and, you know, this pimple here and that pimple there, and why you know, those things are happening, we are going to be led along by the nose. We're going to continue with this system of capitalism and imperialism. And quite frankly, it's destroying the planet. So it's a pretty exciting time right now in the US because of the explosion of the Occupy movement on September 17th in New York, on Wall Street, in response to a call in what is called an obscure Canadian magazine, which I love, called Adbusters. It's edited by a man from Estonia who suggested in a July, I believe it was July 2011, that people go down to Wall Street and make themselves heard. Now, he wasn't saying, you know, take your tents and sleeping bags, but go there and, you know, do something. And that's what happened on September 17th, to everyone's surprise. The corporate media, of course, did their usual sterling job of completely ignoring them initially, and then deriding and dismissing them as, you know, Woodstock nostalgic people, people looking to score weed, and, you know, not very clean, not well dressed, not well kempt. I mean, all of a sudden they were worried about housing, you know, health issues. When 50 million Americans have no health care whatsoever, they were all of a sudden concerned about a handful of people at Wall Street, at Zuccotti Park, you know, and the health conditions there. And of course, you know, Occupy, it is said, is inspired by what happened in Tahrir Square, but I think what also happened in Madison, much closer to home, had a major influence as well. This is, one could say, almost a global rebellion against neoliberalism, against globalization, against the capitalist imperial system, of which the United States is the leader, the unquestioned leader. That system is in crisis now. No one can challenge that assertion. We are now in year 5 of this current economic crisis, which is called the Great Recession. One will note, beginning with the Reagan recession, the first one in the early 1980s, that each succeeding what is called euphemistically an economic downturn. Millions of people lose their homes, they lose their jobs, they lose their dignity, they lose their health care, their pensions. That's called an economic downturn. I think a catastrophe might be the proper word that should be used there. During each subsequent economic crash since the first one of Reagan has been longer and more intense, including the savings and loans crash, the internet bubble that burst, and starting in 2007, the bubble that was burst with the housing market. And I think that speaks to the fundamental instability of this economic system, which no one will talk about. It careens from crisis to crisis, from booms to bust. Yes, billionaires are created. Billionaires are created in India. India now is producing more billionaires than any country on the face of the earth, and is also producing the greatest number of poor people. In fact, there's more malnutrition and poverty in India today than all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. Sub-Saharan Africa kind of being the benchmark for poverty and suffering. That's going on, hand in hand with the creation of huge amount of wealth. And to the credit of the Occupy movement, they have injected into the political discourse, almost by force, the idea of income inequality. Not enough about wealth inequality, and I'll explain the difference because it's very significant, but there has been a huge increase in media mentions of income inequality, and even some discussion, about, well, why is this happening? What is it about this economic system, which is, of course, the best ever created? What is it that keeps producing these kinds of inequities? Income inequality is simply wages. So if you make $80,000 and I make $60,000, you have an advantage of $20,000. That's income inequality. That's not wealth inequality. Wealth inequality comes into play, as it should, when we start talking about other economic factors, such as your house in Gstaad, Switzerland, your condo in Aspen, your yacht club membership, your golf club membership, your private jet, your helipads, your New York apartment, your Hollywood apartment. That is wealth inequality, and that has simply gone through the roof in terms of that. So you have this income inequality on one hand, which is severe and acute. In 1978, in the late 70s, the average CEO's pay was 35 times more than the average workers. This is a median kind of statistic. Today it's 10 times that. Within 3 decades, it went from 35 times, your boss was making 35 times what you were making, to your boss is making 350 times what you're making. Plus, he's getting all these other perks, as I mentioned, the condos, the great lunches or dinners at the Four Seasons, where they can take out their mistress or their family and then write that off as a business expense. If you go to Subway or KFC and have a bite to eat, you can't write that off as a business expense. But, I as a CEO, even though I'm entertaining my mistress or whoever it may be, I can do that and say, well, this was a legitimate business expense. I was talking about possible stock options and the growth of the hedge fund that we had been investing in. So they're able to game the system like crazy. They have the money, obviously. And as Bob Dylan says, money doesn't talk, it swears, to hire the best lawyers and the best accountants. So many of these things that they do are absolutely legal under this particular system. I'll give you a couple of more examples. I mean, we're not that far removed from April 15th. I suspect some of you paid taxes. Let's take Ingersoll Rand, a pretty big corporation. For some reason, they pay $26,000 a year to have a P.O. box in Bermuda. Now, what would be the benefit of that? I mean, $26,000. I mean, you could still buy a few lattes and cappuccini here in, Austin. It's not a, small amount of money. Well, it turns out by that little trick of having that P.O. box in Bermuda, they save $40 million in taxes every year. $40 million that's not going into the Treasury, that's not then going to help states fund public education, which is under enormous attack in this state and in other states, most sharply now in what had been the jewel of the American educational system, California. There's tremendous cutbacks. So that money's not going into the, into the receipt of the federal government. There's in 2010, you may have heard of this corporation called General Electric. They used to bring the good things to light and to life. They made $14 billion net profit in 2010. Not bad. Again, you might buy a condo here in Austin, maybe outside, maybe in Cedar Park, not in the city itself. And they didn't pay any taxes that year because all of those earnings were outside the U.S. Some of you have heard of Apple. You may even have an Apple product. Who knows? They have a couple of people working in Reno, Nevada. And by having a couple of people working in Reno, Nevada, a state, incidentally, which has no taxes, they do not pay any taxes in the state of California, where their Cupertino base is. And again, California right now suffering tremendously from the economic crisis. And this repeats itself over and over again. There's a terrific book about this by David K. Johnson, a former New York Times financial reporter. And I think it's called Perfectly Legal. So they're able to get the accountants and the tax lawyers that are able to work the system. So I think the other analogy I'd like to leave you with is the one of rotten apples and rotten barrels. I mean, I referred briefly to it in terms of the trees and the forests, but all of the attention is on the rotten apples. All of these, the wizards on Wall Street who are crooks, who do unscrupulous things, let's get rid of them. Let's tighten up regulation. Wasn't it terrible that Clinton abolished the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999? If there had only been a little more oversight and a little more scrutiny, none of these things would have ever happened. I think if you believe stories like that, you may also believe that pigs fly. It's plausible, but I think you'll have a hard time demonstrating it. And so we need to be talking about that barrel that keeps producing these rotten apples, and that is capitalism. This is the time to talk about it, and I think no one does a better job than Richard Wolff. I met him in mid-September last year in Santa Fe, and I was immediately taken with his ability to present kind of difficult economic information in a very accessible and clear and transparent way without any kind of, pedantic lingo or jargon. And so I decided to do this book with him. It's a series of interviews. And I think it's the best. I've done lots of interview books, and I know, he must be saying that because he's trying to sell this book. But of all the books I've done, all the interview books with Tariq Ali and Arundhati Roy and Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed and Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, I think this is the best book because it is so pertinent to what is going on right now. And it also has not just a critique of the system, but what can be done. What the alternatives are, and that's the whole last chapter. And I think particularly if we're going to address issues of economic justice, if we're going to have an environment that will sustain us and our children and grandchildren in the future, we have to seriously look at the kind of predatory capitalism that Marx said had a werewolf hunger for profits. It does have a werewolf hunger for profits. And you can see that in the early 1980s when American wages, the workers' wages went flat. And several things were happening right around that time that Wolf talks about in the book. Wages go flat. Corporations profits go up, by the way. This is a period of enormous expansion as well. Profits go up. Corporations discover outsourcing. There's a race to the bottom internationally. So factories that were making, let's say, carpentry things, furniture in North Carolina, all of a sudden found themselves in Bangladesh. They were paying 1/100th of the wages. They didn't have a union to deal with. There's no environmental regulations. There's no health regulations. There's no OSHA to provide some kind of cover for workers. So you had that going on externally, loss of those kinds of jobs. And then even internally, there was a kind of colonization going on in the United States where major factories or new factories were being located in the Deep South. Now again, why did Mercedes-Benz and Audi and BMW, why did they all set their new factories, their investment in Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina? Well, for the food, the warm climate. No, these are non-union states. You have an attack on the unions that begins with Reagan, right out of the box. The attack on the air traffic controllers union, which broke the back of that union. And, the union movement, which at one time was 35, 36, 37% of the workforce was unionized in this country, is now down in the single digits. This has been one of the great goals of the capitalist class, of the ruling elites, to smash the unions and to make capital supreme. So all the workers will be on their knees begging the boss, please treat me a little bit better. Can I get an extra nickel? And I don't want a pension. I don't want paid vacation. I don't want paid sick days. I don't want any of those things. I just want a job. So they really, they've got people exactly where they want them. It's also in the 80s when after the wages go flat that we're flooded with invitations to get credit cards. Gee, how did that happen? All of a sudden, interest rates were then fairly low. Credit was made available, and people started going into debt because they weren't earning as much. Prices were going up. Their wages went flat. So there's more and more borrowing starting at that time. All of these factors are occurring almost simultaneously. And I think what Richard Wolff does in his book is explain how the bankers have brought not just this economy to the brink of collapse, but the world economy now is threatened. We got sold out, they got bailed out. Even when we talk about capitalism, I just want to correct myself. We should always preface that with the words, this peculiar and particular type of capitalism. Because we do not have laissez-faire capitalism in the United States. We have a capitalism that is highly intervened by state power through the tax code, through brakes on royalties, through direct subsidies to the oil, petrochemical complex, to the arms industry, which is enormous in this country. And talking about, I must say also taxes, we keep hearing about, high taxes inhibit the great entrepreneurial spirit of our workers who are, want to create things, but high taxes is just inhibiting that spirit from flourishing. What nonsense, what BS is that? I'm on the radio, so you have to watch 7 words that cannot be uttered, otherwise you could lose your license in the world's second largest democracy here. And so it was in the 1950s, the tax rate was 91% under Eisenhower. What's also going on in the 1950s? The greatest period of productivity and wealth creation in the history of the United States. And I must say, part of that was also the introduction into the workforce of something like 10 to 12 million GIs who got a free education because the American people and the American government decided at that time this would be a good thing to have an educated workforce. They were educated. They come into the educated by 50, 51, 52. The GI Bill, I think, started in 47. And you had this huge expansion of wealth and wealth creation. That's when, the suburbs developed, and Eisenhower built the interstate highway system at that time, although it had a military component as well, but it made the possibility of this kind of growth possible. Today, that top-end tax rate is 35%. And guess what? Nobody's paying it. Half the corporations are paying about 17, 18%, and the others are not paying any percent, very little of that. And no less of an authority than Warren Buffett. You always try and get quotes from that side. You don't want to quote Chomsky because you know what he's about. But Warren Buffett said, there's a class war going on in this country, and my side's winning it. I mean, there you have it. I mean, a clear admission as to what's going on. The tax code is a major bludgeon and instrument of class war, and we've seen a massive amount of transfer of wealth flood up. You remember that other Reagan slogan of the 80s, trickle-down economics? Well, we were all going to benefit from that because the rich people love us so much that, they're going to shower us with all the extra money. Well, there was and a rising tide lifts all boats. Something is a little, again, omitted from that little ditty, and that is that, the boats are yachts, and the rest of us, they're all rising. The rest of us are in canoes and kayaks and rowboats, and we're sinking right to the bottom of the river. So all of these things are, going on during the 80s, the 90s. We're going right through, and I have to stress, and I don't think this should come as a shock to anyone. This is basically a bipartisan policy. There's total agreement about imperialism. There's only questions about tactics. Should we bomb Iran before the election or after the election? Should we use the Israeli Air Force or not use the Israeli Air Force? So let's have a debate, about those kinds of issues. And the same thing with capitalism. There's to this peculiar form of state intervention, capitalism. Let me stress that again. I don't want to fall into that trap of just saying capitalism, because this is a peculiar kind of capitalism that Adam Smith would never recognize. The Adam Smith that they all love to quote, but probably have never read. Someone who was very, very critical of the British looting of India and Bengal in particular. India had in the 17th, 18th century, had a huge economic base. I mean, they were making ironclad ships as no one else was at the time. They had an enormously sophisticated textile industry. I believe in Dhaka, which is today the capital of Bangladesh, there were actually lights in the streets. There was gas lights in the streets when the Europeans were still lighting candles. Incidentally, the word loot comes to us from South Asian languages because the British they used the word so often as they were pillaging and plundering that particular empire. And oil also, of course, oil, Texas, how can you avoid it, is at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, despite all the protestations about, responsibility to protect and women's rights and those kinds of things. The State Department said it very clearly, describing Middle East oil as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. And it's always been about oil and its location in the Middle East that has driven U.S. foreign policy, starting crucially in the Suez Canal on February 12, 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt, exactly 2 months before he died, met with Ibn Saud on a U.S. destroyer, the Quincy, and there they cemented this deal, this Faustian bargain, where the U.S. would protect arguably the most homophobic, misogynist, patriarchal regime on the face of the earth for access to Saudi oil. And the document was signed. To this day, Saudi Arabia is very much protected by the U.S. So I'm going to actually close with a little bit of poetry and art, because I think with our real artist here, that art and poetry somehow get us out of this muck, you know. I feel like I've stirred up a hornet's nest here, and that, you know, art and poetry are able to expand our horizons in creative ways and to see that another world is possible. So I want to start with actually an Urdu poem, Urdu being the national language of Pakistan, and it's called Bol, B-O-L, and it's a Hindi and Urdu word. You can all learn this now. It's the imperative to speak. This particular poem was written by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, F-A-I-Z, the greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century. He was born in Sialkot, Punjab in 1911. He died in 1984. He was a Red. He was a communist. He was a journalist. He was jailed multiple times by the military dictators that the United States so fervently supported since Pakistan was created in 1947. And you see these words at demonstrations in Hindi, the same word in the Devanagari script, and in Urdu in Pakistan, and I've, many times. Bol ke lab azah hai teri, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is enough time. Enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol, Faiz Ahmed Faiz. The second poem I want to read is by Marge Piercy. This is one of Howard Zinn's favorite poems. It's from her collection, The Moon is Always Female, and it's called The Low Road. And I think this speaks to solidarity and collective action. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can do anything. You can't stop them. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they just roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob, can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, love, conviction, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. You have solidarity, your own media. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again, and they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Marge Piercy. And finally, one of my personal heroes, someone who inspired me very much, Gil Scott-Heron, who passed away last year, acknowledged by rappers today as the progenitor of the rap idiom. And one of his most famous kind of compositions is "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." I think it's set to A Night in Tunisia. So you'll not be able to stay home. You'll not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You'll not be able to lose yourself on Law and Order and Star Trek reruns, skip out for beer during commercials, because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs in 4 parts without commercial interruption. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by CBS, PBS, NPR, CNN, or Fox, and will not star Julia Roberts and Tom Hanks. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of zits. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner, because the revolution will not be televised. ABC, MSNBC, NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:01 or report from 29 states. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. You'll not have to worry about your iPhones, iMacs, iTunes, iPads, iClouds, or iPods. The revolution will not be televised. There will not be a theme song written by Barry Manilow, sung by Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, or Lady Gaga. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back about a message about white out, white chocolate, or white people. The revolution will not go better with Coke or Pepsi. The revolution will not be televised, not be televised, not be televised, not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun. The revolution will be live. Thank you very much. Are we close today to fascism? I'm a little hesitant to use that word because of the connotations it has. You know, it immediately conjures up, images of death camps and stormtroopers and Nuremberg rallies. But I think we see a growing trend of totalitarianism in the United States. There's more and more abrogation of our basic liberties. I mean, you don't have to go far. Just go to the airport here or go to Houston, and you see it in action on one level. I mean, that's kind of like in your face, including, the pat-downs and the searches. But I think on a more subtle level is what's happening in cyberspace, where the government, and this one in particular, is boasting about its ability to listen to any cell phone call, to track emails, to read emails. Government now has, under the rubric of always protecting us, it's all about protection. When states take away rights from its citizens, it's about protecting them. It's for your own good. I'm doing these things, taking away your freedoms, because I really, like you and want you to have a good life and not, be attacked by terrorists, who are going to destroy our freedoms. Meanwhile, we're giving up our freedoms left, right, and center. The president now has, this is like right out of The Godfather. He has a hit list. He's presented, here's the chief executive officer of the United States of America has a hit list in which he is able to determine who lives and dies, including American citizens. This is, again, it's always useful to go into popular culture maybe to sometimes explain things. The Godfather, I think there, if you look at The Godfather as a kind of representative of American foreign policy, you can see how it operates. You obey, you kiss my hand, you genuflect in front of me, and I take care of you. Your kids need money for tuition to go to UT? No problem. Here's a check. It's your wife's birthday? I'll send you 2 dozen roses. You need a little help with your mortgage? No problem. I'll help you out with that. But if you cross me, dude, you're dead. It's just like that. It's murder incorporated. And in fact, it was Johnson himself when he took over from Kennedy in '63, when he was shown by a high State Department official what the United States was doing in Latin America. He said, this is like murder incorporated. Assassinations, coups d'etats, invasions. He had information right then that the United States was going to overthrow the democratically elected government of Brazil, which is exactly what happened in 1964, which unleashed a torrent of national security states all over Latin America, particularly in the southern cone, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, resulting in mass suffering and many, many thousands of people killed. So you see that kind of thing. There's also there's a quote from, let me see if I can find it. There's a quote from FDR. Well, let me paraphrase it. That's kind of making the rounds. And in it he says, and he's a patrician himself, New York governor, then 4-time president, not exactly, a devotee of Marx. But he said, when corporations have so much influence over government policies, that can be called fascism. So let's see, is there any kind of consensus in this room that corporations might have some influence, in the United States? Let's ask that rhetorically. I think, the response would probably be unanimous. Yes, indeed. So there's certainly a danger, increasing danger of intolerance, of scapegoating, of immigrants, of Muslims, of Arabs in particular. You see all of those kinds of things. You know, as you have more and more economic dislocation, there's a greater tendency and an impulse to find someone to blame, because you don't want people to be looking at the system that produces these crises. You want them to blame Mexicans. You want them to blame illegal immigrants, you know, who are stealing jobs that supposedly ordinary Americans, you know, are dying to have, like cleaning toilets and, you know, washing dishes. And they're the ones that are causing, you know, all of this economic turmoil. So I think it's a very dangerous moment in U.S. history, and I think, you know, we as citizens, we need to be vigilant about the perils that we're facing and the attacks on our basic rights, like the right of assembly. What does it mean when the state moves in on these tent encampments and says, you cannot pitch your tents here? There is something called right of assembly, if you're peaceful assembly. The right of collective bargaining, free speech. Speech too is being limited and, you know, cordoned off and segmented. We have this obscenity now, and many of you have been in demonstrations, I suspect, I don't know about Austin, where we're penned into free speech zones. Okay, you want to have your little demonstration, okay, boys and girls, come over here, and you can walk around in this little area with your signs, and aren't we great and liberal and so democratic, and isn't America the greatest country in the world? I mean, that's the kind of thing that's, you know, that's going on right now. And, you know, under the cover of the war on terror, there's just been an enormous erosion of civil liberties. I think Glenn Greenwald has written very eloquently about this. Michael Ratner, Center for Constitutional Rights, has talked about it, written about it. But our voices are not being heard because the masters, you know, the executive, the Supreme Court, and almost all the members in Congress are not paying attention to the people. And so you have this kind of schizophrenic situation in the country, which I think is, you know, very dangerous. And I'm quite concerned about it. Can we talk about alternatives to capitalism, and what about regulations to make it work? I think there is a system that has not been paid very much attention to. It's certainly been the target of vituperation and vilification and misunderstanding and propaganda and misinformation, and that is socialism. I think it's a very good word. It has been besmirched. As Howard Zinn once told me, you know, the greatest disaster that ever befell socialism was when the Soviet Union incorporated that term into its title, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There can be no socialism without democracy, without the voice of the people being heard. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian, top-down authoritarian state. It had nothing to do with socialism. And of course, the capitalist class, you know, went to town and totally played that up and said, well, you had your socialist chance. Did you see? They ran it into the ground. Is that what you want? Well, what is this system? What does it say about this system? I mentioned about all the people that don't have homes, with all the vacant houses in this country and apartments and condos. What about all the people who want work? Millions of people are out of work. There are millions of things to do: transportation, the environment, healthcare. I mean, do I have to, you know, make a list? And what does it say about a system that cannot bring these things together? I think it speaks to a fundamental flaw and failure of that system. And so in the last part of Occupy the Economy, Richard Wolff talks about, you know, what are the alternatives? You know, is it going to happen overnight? Are the American people ready to embrace socialism? Of course not. Let's not kid ourselves. This is also a process of education. So even while now there's a move to amend, to reverse the heinous Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, it may not succeed, but I think it's important because it's an educational effort as well about what's going on internally in the country. So I think some degree of planning is necessary. It's absolutely impossible to address the acute environmental crises that are going to be flooding over us, literally in some cases, in the coming decades without collective action. You know, and now, oh, collective, does that mean like you're in favor of gulags? Death camps? Yeah, right. I'm in favor of gulags and death camps. Everyone should go to Siberia. That's what they're going to say. You know, that's going to be the propaganda response to anyone talking about collective action. But it's impossible to address global warming, climate change as a one-off. Canada cannot do it by itself. Bangladesh cannot do it. Ivory Coast cannot do it. Tanzania cannot do it. It has to be a global effort. So we have to think about that. And, you know, I don't want to use Armageddon-like language, but it's very hard to get the attention of the American people without using apocalyptic language. I think that's a real cultural problem right now. You know, so when we hear about tipping points and turning points and you know, it is now irreversible what has happened in terms of climate change. It's still astonishing how difficult it is, and maybe it shouldn't be so astonishing. It's so difficult to get your mind around, your hands around the idea of extinction, or the end of civilization as we know it. It's very hard to conceptualize that. Maybe it's like when you're a kid, you can't imagine your parents dying. You know, you don't know what that could mean, how it would happen. You know, I remember when my neighbor's mother died, I was like 5 or 6, I was in total shock. I thought parents live forever. Nothing lives forever. We cannot take this precious place that we live on, that Carl Sagan called this pale blue dot in the universe. We cannot take it for granted. We've been treating it like a dumpster. You know, just garbage, spewing everything into the ocean. And Mother Nature, in her way or his way or its way, is responding to the constant pounding, the constant humiliation, the constant, toxification. Yes, good. I haven't used that word. The question is about, what can be done? The question that comes up at every single gathering that I and others address around the country. Okay, great critique. Capitalism sucks. Okay, it should be pretty clear by now. Imperialism, not so good. Hurting a lot of people, hurting ourselves. What can be done? I think what can be done has to be answered locally. You are here in this community. I'm going back to Boulder tomorrow, but you have this community. First of all, you're fortunate in Austin to have an independent community radio station. There aren't a lot of cities, I mentioned some of them, but some of the biggest cities in the United States don't have community radio, including Philadelphia, Baltimore, Miami, Boston, and other places around the country. So co-op radio, certainly deserves your support and participation as well. I don't know what level of political activity there is here in Austin in terms of the Occupy movement. Do you have CSAs, farmers markets? Is there any kind of movement, back to the land about providing for the homeless? Those are all initiatives, I think, that you would know the best answers to, because you live here in this community and you know your neighbors. And it's through collective action that things can happen. And we've seen this particularly in the food movement. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been an explosion around the country in farmers markets. I mean, in some towns have 2, 3 farmers markets a week. CSAs have grown. I mean, that's, on one level, there's been a kind of a collective actually recognition by many, many Americans, not just people on the left or progressives, that there's something seriously wrong with our food supply, that it's contaminated, that it's toxic, that organic, GM-free food is something, that we should be striving for as a community, as a cultural goal, and as an economic goal as well. And so those are the kinds of things that can happen locally. Acting together is so important, because what the system, or whatever you want to call it, the ruling elite, they want you to be atomized. They want you in front of your screen, whether it's your iPhone or your computer or your television or whatever screen you're locked into, absolutely, locked off and cut off from any kind of interaction. So this is a very valuable kind of meeting this evening. So overcoming that sense of isolation is really important. There's an old union slogan, there's power in a union. There's power in group activity. You as a one-off, you might write a great letter to Governor Perry, and he may say, thanks a lot, really appreciate your writing, have a nice day. And that's the end of it. But if 100 people, like Marge Piercy said in that poem, if 100 people rise up and do something, they'll listen. They'll listen. 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people. And right now there's an opportunity in the country because of the economic crisis. There's an opening, there's an aperture, and we need to pour energy into that opening and widen it more so that there'll be more discussion about democracy and about the actual economic system as it exists, not the fantasies that are taught in economics departments like the University of Texas or at Harvard, about the free market system. It's not a free market system. It's heavily connected to state power and to state money. Please contact me at info@alternativeradio.org if you want to write to me, info@alternativeradio.org. Thanks very much.
The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.